Hi, I'm Emily Hauser, and I am a blogger on Open Zion on the Daily Beast, where I write a lot about Israel-Palestine. But I also blog at my own place and have written a fair amount of commentary in the national press about a whole lot of different issues, some of which Alyssa and I will be touching on today. And now I'll let Alyssa introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Alyssa Rosenberg. I'm the culture blogger for Think Progress, a columnist for Slate at XX, and the TV correspondent for TheAtlantic.com. So thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure.
Well, and it's so fun for me to be able to talk with you like this. You're kind of we have kind of a geek love for you in our house. We've been following your work for a long time, so it's a lot of fun for me to be able to do this with you. Thank you for agreeing to it.
Well, that's really nice of you. And I think both of us sort of come out of Ta-Nehisi Coates' comment section, right?
Yes, that's true. We do have that meeting point, as so many people seem to have, of Ta-Nehisi Coates at The Atlantic. That's absolutely true.
He's a fun guy to hang around with and a good discussion starter. So it's nice.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I wish I could actually hang around with him. I'm in the middle of the country, though, so it's not as easily, he's not as readily available to the likes of the Midwest. Anyway. So one of the things that you and I have both been writing about a lot lately, though you far more than me, has been the question of the role of women in a lot of pop culture enterprises and how women are seen and how women are processed and how that's a very, very big umbrella. But a lot of stuff has fallen under it in the past month or two, don't you think?
There are a lot of depictions of women in popular culture, and so there is a lot to sort of tear off and chew from the things that are offered up to us. It does seem in the past 6 months or so that we've seen a real upswing in people saying kind of patently ludicrous things about women in entertainment, whether it's someone like producer Lee Aronson sort of jokingly complaining that we've reached peak vagina on television because, oh my God, there are a couple of television shows that star young women being sexual and funny.
Right.
Or, debates about female superheroes in the Marvel Universe and, whether it's possible to make a intelligent, funny, coherent rape joke, something that was ignited by Daniel Tosh's attempt to be funny a couple of weeks ago. So it's been busy.
Right, exactly. And one of the things that really strikes me is that we so often, and by we I think I mean both women who write about these things and generally society, which is, again, a very, very big umbrella. But I think that we tend to approach each of these moments as individual moments without necessarily trying to, or having the time perhaps, to step back a few steps and say, wait, these things are not entirely unconnected. There's a connection between the fact that Daniel Tosh feels comfortable jokingly wishing gang rape on a heckler, and Charlie Sheen gets a new TV show to allow him to present his misogyny to the world at large, and, on and on and on. Is it a frustration for you to be looking at these things as individual moments? Do you find yourself able to pull back and look at the whole thing? How do you take that?
Sure. I sort of see three discrete things going on here. First is economic incentives. Charlie Sheen got hired by the FX network because he makes a lot of money in reruns for them. They rerun 2.5 Men, which is a CBS show, and they've made an enormous amount of money syndicating that program. And it's a weird sort of outlier show on their network. They're known for, kind of gritty dramas, like Kurt Sutter's Sons of Anarchy, experimental comedy like Louis C.K.'s Louis. And so to have this kind of, generic show floating out there didn't entirely fit with their brand, but it did sort of present them with an opportunity. If they could make a show that would result in enough episodes to get to syndication, then FX would both have sort of a content partner for its 2.5 Men reruns on FX, and it would have something that it could package up and sell to other networks. So his show is, packaged up in a deal where if the first 10 episodes of the show that have been produced hit certain ratings thresholds, then the network will produce 90 other episodes of the show, and in fairly, cheap, quick succession, and it's basically a way for them to make a buck. Someone like Daniel Tosh, who I don't happen to think is particularly funny, even when he isn't saying that gang rape is super hilarious, has one of the highest rated shows on Comedy Central. There is a powerful economic base for this kind of product, and I think it's important not to forget that, because it is important for the two other points that I want to make. The first of which is that some of this reaction is simply to privileged people being challenged. Lee Aronson makes kind of generic dude bro television shows, and when something like Two Broke Girls, a situation comedy starring Kat Dennings that airs on CBS, does extremely well, and when people start giving even a few women showrunners shows of their own, his economic base and his sort of lock on the kind of dumb Freddy comedy that he does is, it is threatened. There are only so many shows that networks are going to put on the air, and for some men, women's success means trade-offs for them. I think that's not true in most spheres of life, but, in a medium like television where there's time slotting, that is absolutely true. So some of that is people reacting to privilege. People don't want to be told that, girls can be just as funny as Charlie Sheen playing Lothario. Daniel Tosh doesn't want to be told that maybe he has to think harder about his material. And then I think the third thing that we're seeing is people trying to find ways to talk about women's issues, and men in particular who aren't exceptionally educated around these issues and are stumbling. Someone like Ron Rosenberg, who is an executive at the company who makes Tomb Raider, got himself in a lot of trouble recently for saying that there would be an attempted sexual assault in the new Lara Croft game, and that it would be sort of a great opportunity for players to sympathize with the character. And, at the end of the day, I sort of get what he was trying to say, that, he believes the people who play this game care about Lara Croft, and that seeing her sexually assaulted would be or in danger of sexual assault would be a really upsetting experience. His comments actually get to a bunch of issues about how gamers identify with their avatars in game, and, sort of whether the only way men can identify with women or feel protective with women is when they're in danger. But I think that we're at a really interesting point where there's starting to be incentives for companies who can produce product that represents women's experience sort of empathetically and with humor. But there are a lot of people who are these powerful male gatekeepers who don't entirely know how to talk about this stuff, whether to their core audience or to anyone else. And I actually think we saw some of that on The Daily Show last night when Louis C.K. talked about the perception that he had been supportive of Daniel Tosh in this particular incident, and, said it sort of walked this fine line between talking about how, the experience had educated him about rape culture, and that sort of understanding how rape corrals women's lives is a part of him now. It's something that he's really absorbed. At the same time, he has this audience that kind of responds when he pokes at stereotypes, and so he makes some jokes about feminists being humorless and the comedians being sensitive. I think that people are starting to want to talk about things faster than they're gaining the language to be able to do that. And all three of those factors make this a really important moment. The incentives haven't shifted all the way. Being super misogynist doesn't lose you advertisers or a job. And we're a long way from being at that kind of point.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts, and we'll now have to decide which to start with. One of the things that I think is most interesting is that while I don't entirely understand the economic incentive because I haven't studied it closely, and I think it's probably pretty straightforward, but it's not one of those things that I've read about at great length. So there are things I won't know about it. Having said that, I think it's interesting that people are failing to take into consideration that women make up half the population. So if women are allowed to feel more comfortable in, and I think this is particularly true in terms of the gaming community, because there you're an active participant as opposed to, say, deciding to flop down on the couch and watch FX or not, right? In the gaming community, you make this conscious choice to to be an active participant. And if you have a chance of perhaps not strictly speaking doubling, but greatly increasing the number of people who will feel comfortable in your product, doesn't that also have a bottom line implication?
I mean, it potentially does, but, we are conditioned as women to spend our money on stuff that doesn't represent us well or at all. Right. And, I think that this is something where, I'm not going to not go see a Batman movie or the Avengers because we're not at a strict gender ratio.
Right.
I don't want to deny myself enjoyment, but I wish that we lived in a culture where men were as conditioned to seek out culture that is majority female and felt like they would have sort of an enjoyable, pleasurable experience out of that in the same way. Because
the whole notion of peak vagina being so absurd. Is it really that difficult for men to enjoy television programming that has mostly women?
Hugely. I think stuff like that hugely underestimates male audiences.
Right.
I hear from readers all the time who love strong, interesting, complex, weird female characters.
Right.
And, I think they feel they benefit from spending time in the company of those characters.
And I can tell you...
I just wanted to say one more thing,
Sure.
which is that I think that as much as I wish there was this sort of giant market power to be unlocked by appealing to women, we're kind of unlocked. I mean, I think that people, women are participants in the market.
Yeah.
And that, I think the financial incentives for, shows that star men or are aimed at men will change when men want different things in their entertainment. I've loved seeing men get up in arms about how awful the prevalence of prison rape jokes in culture is. I mean, prison rape is one of the reasons that sexual assault rates for men are so high.
Right.
And, I think that is the glimmer of a conversation that needs to happen. I think that, but I really think that men and women are both going to need to sort of change their needs and their incentives for companies to respond.
Well, and it's interesting to me that you bring up the question of how much are we underestimating men, because this is one of the things that drives me nuts. I think that we're wildly underestimating the capacity of men for compassion and for nurture and for what I think of as common decency. The assumption that men need a particular kind of humor in order to be jollied along into spending their money or spending their time. I mean, I can give you the example that last night, as we watched Louis C.K., I was kind of squirming in my seat because to me it felt like he does this thing. It occurred to me this morning that Louis C.K. does this thing where he couches the somewhat revolutionary thing that he's throwing at you with his humor. He frames it, he often will frame it in these tropes that allow you to work your way into it and then work your way out, right, without being too upset on the way. And there are times when that makes perfect sense to me because that allows for an easier acceptance of new information, right? But
sure.
last night, it just felt lazy. Feminists are humorless, honestly, and women just want to talk about their feelings and only their feelings matter. And by the way, apparently being concerned about rape is a question of emotion.
I mean, look, I'm not going to defend the framing because I wasn't crazy about it either.
Right.
But
the thing that I was going to say, hold on, the thing that
Sure.
I was going to say actually was that I was sitting there kind of squirming and I said out loud, I don't know what to do about that. And my husband said, that wasn't any better than I expected. He completely wrote it off. It was like, I don't care what he said in the middle. Everything else was just stupid and lazy standard comedian tropes. And my husband, a man, didn't go for it. And I think about the men who you referred to in a recent post who have have really tried to present themselves as allies in the question of the woman whose name escapes me right now, but you will come up with it.
Anita Sarkeesian.
Right. And I've recently been seeing some stuff back and forth between people and the men in the gaming industry on Twitter who I've just stumbled on, you know, completely randomly, but men reaching out to other men and saying, the gaming industry has got to take a stand on this. Men in the gaming industry have to start talking about this. So to me, it's like these are all examples of the kind of men that so much of pop culture underserves and underestimates, if you see what I mean.
Sure. I mean, I want to go back to Louis C.K. for a minute.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, I mean, part of what I find really interesting about him as a comedian is he has this shtick that he uses, and Jim Poniewozik wrote about it for Time just beautifully today, about how his character, the highest value his character has is sort of curiosity and interrogation. And in previous seasons of Louis, that's often taken the form of a younger blonde woman who challenges him in some way, whether it's the cheerleader on his USO tour or during the episode Duckling, who complains about how gross his jokes are, or the, you know, blonde Christian anti-masturbation advocate he encounters. And, you know, I kind of think of these like his straw blondes, right? He, you know, his character listens to them and then sort of ultimately is unable to implement the things that they're proposing in his life. Or he shows them, like the cheerleader in Duckling, that even though he makes super gross jokes, he's, you know, he's a decent person. He's taking care of his daughter's duck in Afghanistan. And the show's shifted.
One of the best hours of television ever, by the way. I find
Duckling. One of the things that's great about Duckling is yes, it's about issues. It's about the war in Afghanistan. But the thing that it's really about is the universal appeal of the pratfall, which I think is just genius. It's an hour-long meditation on comic form. It's great. But the thing that attracts me to Louis C.K. as a comedian is his openness and his curiosity. And in this season of the show, in the episode that airs Thursday, it starts a multi-episode arc with Parker Posey as a woman who works in a bookstore who Louis gets interested in and asks out, and sort of what happens when they go out on a date. And, you know, what upset me about the perception I had, which thank God turns out to be false, that Louis was supporting Daniel Tosh, is that I saw him as part of this kind of epistemic closure among comedians. This, you know, and something that, you know, Patton Oswalt got in the act too, in a sense, sort of moderated his comments, this idea that comedians have to close ranks at all costs. And what the Daily Show appearance did for me as a critic and as a consumer of his comedy was reaffirm to me that he's still learning things, that that epistemic closure that I was worried about, that I think would do great harm to his comedy as well as sort of great harm to the empathy that he projects, that curiosity is still there. And that honestly was the thing that I needed. And I think that in a way curiosity is critical to all of this, that, you know, we want a consumer community that's interested in women's experiences and that values them as highly as it values men's experiences. And I think that is, you know, it's not the easiest point to parse, but it's definitely what's important to me here. And as someone who writes about Louis C.K.'s comedy, and only from that perspective, I got what I needed to feel like he is the comedian I thought he was, if that makes any sense.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that, if I were to strive for one thing, I wouldn't be able to narrow it down. However, one of the things that's really, really important to me, just generally in conversations about politics or society or culture, is, I suppose, to avoid black and white formulation, to avoid expecting Louis C.K. to be exactly and precisely the comedian that I imagine I need in my mind. And to then assume that that will meet the needs of all of America, because clearly I have established what America needs, if you see what I mean. You know, I'm comfortable with my entertainers and my leaders and my writers and my whoever struggling, as long as they're open with the struggle, as long as they are, as you say, remain curious and honest about what we're all sort of unclear about. The one thing, but we're kind of veering towards something that I wanted to get into with that I think is really important. I know that you get a lot of flack. I don't know if it's a lot. It's a regular drip of flack for writing about this stuff on a political site. a thing that...
Yeah, and that's a function of us building our audience, right? Like, the Progress started out as sort of a media watchdog blog. It expanded to include a lot of wonky policy analysis, which I think is amazing. And, I was the first step in something that I think we'll do more of being functioning more like a traditional newspaper, being a place where you can get all of your political and policy news, but also where you can discuss this other stuff too. And I think that some of that is... I think some of that conversation is an inevitable part of a publication broadening its scope. And so...
Well, that may be. But as someone who reads the publication, to me, it strikes me as... First of all, I want to say to whoever says this to you, it's in the job description. If you have an issue with her job description, you need to talk to her editor. She's not doing anything that she wasn't hired to do. But aside from that... I have a really hard time separating out this conversation that you and I have just had from, say, GOP anti-women's reproductive health choice discussions. Sure. We're so busy determining for half of our population, well, we're so busy determining for everybody what being a man, what being a woman is, where those boxes are, how we get to express ourselves inside those boxes. What are the consequences of, sneaking a peek outside of the box? And pop culture is an absolutely crucial and central piece of how we communicate that to each other and process those things.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting to me when I pick up a misconception from popular culture, which does happen, right? I mean, I've definitely found myself thinking that things were more normal or more accepted or more prevalent than they actually are because they recur over and over and over again in popular culture. And if that can happen to me, it's happening to all of us.
Right.
And it's, and I think that one of the things that's, I don't know how old you are. I'm 27, and I was really fortunate to grow up in this time when people were taking a really serious look at depictions of women in popular culture and starting to sort of propagate new tropes and think about new representations. I mean, I grew up with Tamora Pierce writing all of these stories about lady knights and cops and adventurers, and I feel so fortunate for that. And one of the things that I think is a real challenge about media criticism today and media today is that we haven't had that conversation for men. We just haven't had it in the same way, and we haven't had the same creators who have gone out just very deliberately and said, I want something new. There is something very specific that I don't see that I want and that I need. And, I mean, it's not as if women are the only people who are affected by the images of people like them that they see on screen. Right.
And it's not... Well, first of all, I answered your question. I'm 47, so I'm old enough to be your mom if I had gotten going early. But I don't find it's interesting. I didn't grow up feeling like I didn't come into adulthood feeling like I'd had a lack of role models. But in like the past 10 years, and this may be related to my being a mom, I have become aware of how narrow the role models often are. I mean, I was... growing up in the 70s, there was a real effort to expand boundaries. So that was what I was aware of, that we were working on expanding our boundaries. Very free to be you and me and whatnot. And, different people did with that what they would, but I was lucky enough to have a mom who was very, very behind all of that and very, you can do whatever you want to do and all that. But as I come even deeper into my adulthood and I see how limited it still is, I guess 20 years after I was your age and thinking about this stuff in retrospect, there's a lot of stuff that hasn't changed nearly as much as I would like it to have changed now that I'm raising children in this society and in this culture. And the thing for me is very much that I want this to go back to your question of what do men want. I want it as much for my son as I want it for my daughter. They both get to have full lives. I want them both to have full lives and be free to express whatever and whoever they happen to be. But of course, for my daughter to try to expand that, it scans in society as an expansion. Whereas for my son to try to expand that, we are still scanning that as a contraction, as a forfeiting of privilege and of power and all of that. So I think that's probably...
And that's really interesting. I mean, I'd be curious, have there been things that you wouldn't let your son read or that you've steered him towards in terms of books or movies or music, sort of with that in mind? Because I feel like I send lists of books to my friends with daughters a lot, but I haven't done it as much for people with boys.
Well, we pretty much are, you can read whatever you want family. I mean, we're there, or watch whatever you want family. I mean, there are some limitations that we place that are based on emotional complexity. You know, the 9-year-old can't quite, I don't think the 9-year-old girl can yet handle the end of Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog, so she hasn't gotten to watch that yet. But but that's not, that's not censorship. That's trying to be aware of where she's at as a human being, right?
Of course.
So, but having said that, what we do is we talk about stuff a lot. And I really did kind of decide at some point that if I was to err on the side of over speaking, over driving a point home, that was the better side to err on. So when the Disney Channel is on, which it is, not infrequently in my house, and something, there's some particularly egregiously obvious, aren't fat people naturally funny joking going on, I talk about it. And now my kids talk about it because they see it. And my daughter was quizzing me on, and she's 9, right? My daughter was quizzing me on what my favorite Disney Channel show is. And she was not letting me say all my actual favorites, which is Wizards of Waverly Place and That's So Random, which are my actual favorites. She was forcing me to think about the ones I don't like. And then we started talking about Wizards of Waverly Place, and my 9-year-old actually said to me, the thing I like so much about Alex, Mommy, is she's really round, by which she meant a round character. And I thought, wow, these conversations have gone somewhere, So then we talked about, I said, okay, take that idea of that kind of a family, because you've seen that kind of family a million times, right? So we talked about what that means, the mother, the father's half a child himself, the kids, one's crazy, one's stupid, one's whatever, right? The tropes. And then I said, okay, within that same framework, what story would you tell? What TV show would you tell where you change a few things around? So we had that conversation, like what would she change? And just to my mind, and now I'm talking about my daughter, but I've had those conversations with my son as well. To my mind, that's the most important thing, to talk about what they're consuming, not to try to control what they're consuming. Because if you get them thinking about it, that, my son recently pegged someone as sexist and was absolutely correct. He didn't do that because he's alive in 2012. He did that because he's alive in this house having these conversations. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think you're getting at something that adults could use too. I think one of the things that makes these conversations really hard is a sense by some people that folks who criticize entertainment as sexist or racist or anything else often get pegged as, oh, you want to take this away from me. You want, I mean, something that I've heard over and over again in the past week and a half is, you just want to censor people or take their rape jokes away or make it so nobody can say anything controversial ever. To which I say, first off, no, read the blog post from a year ago in which I break down what makes a joke about sexual assault effective and funny and feminist. But two, it's okay to like problematic things. It really is. And I think that, we live in a culture that really encourages people to shape their identity around what they like.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, if you go through Twitter profiles and Facebook profiles and see how often people are defining themselves as X-Files fan, X-Men fan, I mean, these are identity categories now.
Right. No, that's true.
And so people have trouble when that thing that has become this identity category also comes in for a critique. And that's a really interesting place, right? I mean, that's a place where interesting conversations can go on. And, I like a lot of problematic things. I genuinely do. I think the class politics of the Batman movie, the Dark Knight Rises that comes out this Friday, are atrocious, but it also is the best Catwoman we've ever seen. I mean, nothing is as simple as the worst element of it. Well, there may be some things that are as simple as the worst elements, but there are a lot of things that are, have politics that are bad one way, but because they need to get someplace else. And, you know,
well,
it doesn't bother me to live in those contradictions. And I think that's something that, you know, we're not... It's great for people to be passionate, invested fans. That's something that both builds community and that builds corporate brand identity. So both, you know, nerds and corporations love it. But, you know, if you can't have conversations within a community, whether that community is defined by your feminism or the fact that you're super into, you know, a comic book franchise, that community is in trouble. It really is.
Well, and kind of all thought is in trouble. I mean, that's a really big statement, but again, we come right back to, why are you talking about comic books on a political site? We're all reflected in all of these ways, and frankly, similarly, as some people are, you know, DC versus Marvel, other people are Democrats versus Republicans, right? And should you threaten their understanding of what it means to be a Democrat, then, you know, God help you, and all of Twitter will come down on your head. And it's just not okay. And it's not, more to the point, it's not helpful and it's not useful, because we can't move anything forward when we're like that. You know, you said something about the class, you were talking about the things that the place of discomfort in Dark Knight Rises. I had issues with the Avengers, a movie that I loved. Right? We all four of us went. My husband, my kids, and I all went.
I saw it 3 times in 8 days. It is my secret shame.
Well, I, as the mother of 2 young children, the fact that I loved it is proved by the fact that I managed to see it twice with my kids in the theater. But, you know, in an earlier day, 8 times would have made sense to me. I totally would have done that. I wanted to go see it the minute I was done seeing it, both times. Yeah. And having said that, and this is Joss Whedon. I mean, I'm a huge Joss Whedon fan. I'm wearing a Firefly shirt as we speak, okay? Huge Joss Whedon fan. Could he not have had any of those female characters talking to each other? I mean, there are exactly 4 or 3 female characters, and they don't have a conversation. And, you know, so my point being, even when our heroes do something that we love, it's still going to be flawed, because it's created by humans, and humans are flawed. So what do? Do we hunker down in that irritation with the flaws, or do we break it open and try to move it to something that's less flawed?
Well, and I think you're exactly right about sort of hunkering down in our irritation with the flaws. And, you know, something you and I had talked about prior to this conversation was something I tweeted sort of sarcastically, where I said, you know, I wish sexism would be over so I could get back to writing about She-Hulk comics or something. Right. And of course, you know, writing about She-Hulk comics is writing about gender and sexism. But, you know, as a blogger, I find writing about people's screw-ups really exhausting and not that interesting. And it's weird to me that we spend so much more time, I mean, I think just generally on stuff that irritates us than on stuff we like. You know, people will show up more to get angry about something than for something they like. I honestly think in internet dialogue that is kind of true. And it's a tough bias. I combat it as best I can by writing long and detailed when I love something, and sometimes the audience comes and sometimes it doesn't. But we are in a moment of conversation that is conflict oriented, and that's hard. I think it's hard. I don't know a better or more eloquent way to say it.
I think there's almost a sense that anger is more legitimate, or purer, if you will. It's better to write off Firefly for not having Asian actors in it, which is a thing that drives me nuts, than it is, you know, that's somehow more pure than loving the show in spite of that, right?
Yeah, at the same time, then, you know, love, I think, gets written off, and in some cases is sort of pure, uncritical fanboyism. It's been fascinating to watch the early reviews of The Dark Knight Rises come in. A couple of folks wrote negative ones and have been nuked. I mean, they've been nuked so hard for failing to love something enough that Rotten Tomatoes literally shut down its comments and is considering implementing a Facebook commenting system to get rid of the business that they don't want. And so purity in either rejecting culture or in embracing it, I think, are both really unproductive places to come from. And look, everybody has their individual tolerance, right? I mean, this is something I've written about in regards to Game of Thrones a lot. Like, nobody should be required to watch Game of Thrones if scenes and discussions of sexual assault are triggering or upsetting or, beyond their reach. People are allowed to set their own limits, but nothing is always funny and nothing is never funny. Nothing is always good or never good. There are, the places in between those two extremes are where interesting art and interesting conversations about that art happen.
Exactly, and it's often in the guts of the mistake and in the guts of the frailty or the failure that the flaw, as I said before, that really truly is the most interesting thing, because we've come to expect what everything else is too shiny and neat, but when things get messy, it gets interesting. And there's room for forward movement. Yeah, great. Game of Thrones. I'm on the other side of that line. I understand there's a lot of acting going on. I'm assured that the writing is astonishing. I cannot bear to face it. But that's exactly the thing. Like, why does someone feel the need to come along and convince me that I'm wrong about that? It's an interesting question. Why does my disinterest in Game of Thrones threaten someone else's, I guess, self-image, I guess?
Yeah, I think the terms of these conversations are often, burn, fanboy burn, or, you're insufficiently worshipful. They're not productive terms of debate. And sort of to get back to what we initially started talking about, this is why we need a lot of diversity of representation, right?
Yeah.
Because not everybody, some people are going to talk about situations in which jokes about sexual assault can be funny on, The Nation or the Melissa Harris Perry Show, and, really get turned on to new ideas that way. Some of them are going to see Louis C.K., who's this, shambling dude god on The Daily Show, talking about how rape culture, is sort of a revelation to him, and that will change them. Some people will see Game of Thrones and see something that's totally over the line and say, oh, that's what this is part of a system of. I mean, we need a lot of stuff because we're not all the same. We need, if we want culture to make a point and be something other than awesome, or something other than purely awesome or substancelessly awesome, which is too many sibilant S's in there, then we need to reach people a lot of different ways. I mean, homogeneity of representation is homogeneity of ideas. And that is worrisome both for, sort of a representation perspective and an ideas perspective.
Absolutely. And I think that it's entirely reasonable for the side of the argument, well, obviously I think this because I've been arguing it, but the side of the argument that is least well represented to stand up and say, hold on, peak vagina? What the hell are you talking about? Or whatever. I mean, peak vagina is such a great phrase that it's become kind of a rallying cry in my mind. But but for women to come and say, this does not represent my experience, this does not represent the women I know or the life I've led, and then to be shut down, largely by men, but not exclusively, frequently by other women as well, is, as we've been saying, not useful, and I think also damaging to men, and I think damaging to, to our societal efforts, both at culture and at politics. For the reasons you said, homogeneity of representation is homogeneity of thought, and that's not going to move us forward.
Well, and I always try to think about this in terms of, I don't know if you've ever read Speaker for the Dead, the Orson Scott Card sequel to Ender's Game. Mm-hmm. And Orson Scott Card himself is a hugely problematic person. He is, a serious anti-gay bigot who happened to write some incredibly empathetic works of fiction. In Speaker for the Dead, some of the characters are talking about a hierarchy of foreignness. Someone who is, not you, but of your species or your village. Someone who is, not of your species or village, but has the capacity for reason and moral responsibility. And, some of the characters are talking to some aliens who were previously thought not to have reason and capacity for moral responsibility and turn out to. And the aliens say to them, we don't want to destroy you or beat you. We don't want to be there first. We want to be there too. Mm-hmm. And I think that's sort of a powerful de-escalating concept here. Yes, there are some places where, there are a finite number of television shows that can air on the big four networks, and if there are more female showrunners, there are going to be some fewer white male showrunners. That is God's honest truth. But for the most part, in terms of representation and jobs, part of what's great about the expansion of the entertainment industry into streaming is that it provides more opportunities for everyone. We don't want to be there first, we want to be there too.
Right.
And I think if we could sort of de-escalate some of these conversations, they would be richer and deeper and more interesting.
And it's also been my experience, and as someone who writes a lot about Israel-Palestine, I get to have a lot of experience with this, that when you manage to engage with the person who walked up to you all puffed up with anger, you manage to engage with them on a human level, maybe 7 times out of 10, they depuff their anger, and you wind up having a conversation that, may or may not take both of you to new places, but will certainly make the process a lot less painful and will leave open the possibility of new things that otherwise would have been completely closed off.
And I think a lot of anger around culture is the same way. People deploy anger defensively rather than aggressively. They come out swinging because they're afraid that they won't be heard, or that the person they're angry at will be dismissive or won't hear them if they're not angry. Right. And I agree with you that sort of niceness in asking questions is a kind of automatic de-escalator. I think it's also just good for my mental health to not get mad at people online. Exactly.
There's a level of my blood pressure rising that I really don't like to invite in. But anyway, I think that the line, we don't want to be first, we want to be there too, is a really great place to sort of close this circle, because that to me feels like a great expression of how I feel about women in pop culture, women in politics, women in American culture and society generally. I don't want us to be there first. I want us to be there too, and I don't think that's too much to ask.
And I think that, I think the number, I'm just gratified every day of my life, working and not, by the men I talk to who want women to be there too. They don't, there are some men who are sort of very publicly clutching to their privilege with two hands.
Right.
But there are a lot of men whose lives are richer for female creators and female characters and female fellow fans. We are, the sooner we recognize that these are communities that we all have mutual investment in, I think the healthier our culture is.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I was just thinking about something that Whedon said in an interview, I want to say with The Guardian, about, of course, I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it boiled down to supporting and creating, supporting powerful women doesn't weaken men, it makes men more powerful. Mm. And I think, I really think that's true. It sounds very kumbaya and whatever, but we are, to borrow from High School Musical, we truly are all in this together, whether or not we like it.
Do I have to be in it together with Zac Efron's hair? Please say I have to be in it with Zac Efron.
that I'll leave to you. Just like you leave to me whether or not I'll watch Game of Thrones, I will leave that question to you, to your own conscience. But anyway.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, Emily.
Thanks so much for agreeing to it. It was really fun. Thanks a lot.
Happy watching and happy reading.
Same to you. Bye-bye.